Well, I'm an artsy, right? But I like Eugene O'Neill because he's not this guy. This guy's too easy, way too easy, right? This is the kind of person that you can dismiss. This is the kind of, in those real-life cop shows like To Serve and Protect, who are they busting? All the addicts, right? 90% of the people they bust are addicts. People who are down and out. But statistically speaking, actually, this guy is only no more than 3 to 5% of the entire addict population. So where are the others, right? The other 95 to 97% are actually married, go to work every day, have mortgages, and have 1.2 children. Yeah, so, but Eugene O'Neill is particularly, I like him because you can't dismiss this guy this easily. But if we look at the mainstream answers, and Eugene O'Neill, by the way, started drinking at the age of 15 and didn't stop until he was in his early 40s. And even though he was, by the time he had stopped, he had won 3 Pulitzer Prizes and he had written the work that would eventually earn him the Nobel Prize for Literature, he was still drinking through all this period. He didn't stop at all. His drinking was getting reduced, no question, as he, in his artwork, he was growing into recovery. But if we ask the mainstream addictions counselors, like, who is this guy? Who is this drunk? And he's as bad a drunk as any drunk you've ever met, guaranteed. Yeah. Embarrassment, he was waving a gun around, embarrassed the family to no end. His lifestyle mainly was getting drunk and seducing women. That was basically his hobby. Yeah. And if we ask the mainstream, who is this man, they will tell us the old moral model, right? He's immoral. This is the older, what we call the moral model. Growing a lot out of conservative Christianity in the early part of the century. Or if we read Alan Marlett's older work from 1986, at that time Dr. Marlett would say, well, he has poor coping skills, right? So he is, and the solution, of course, would be cognitive behavioral coping skills therapy, relapse prevention therapy. If we have a Freudian bent, we would say he's in denial of his problem. We're going to borrow Anna Freud's construct, personality trait of denial and say, oh, he must be in denial. Doesn't even realize what drinking is due to him. Or we can say, if we're from family systems therapy, we can say he's raised in a dysfunctional family, and that explains it. He is the man bringing homeostasis to the dysfunctional family system. Or if we're into more modern motivational enhancement therapy from William Miller in New Mexico, we can say he lacks internal motivation. And of course, if we're fans of the American Society for Addiction Medicine, the Canadian Society for Addiction Medicine, then we can say he suffers from a disease. Those would be the mainstream answers. But I always question, I mean, is that enough? Can we actually make sense of a man who's won 4 Pulitzer Prizes and a Nobel Prize, who everyone agrees was intensely concerned with living a moral life in this world? And he's not down and out. He's very wealthy. He's very respectable, goes to he's got a nice house, he's got 2 kids, married. I'm not sure his coping skills are all that bad. He gave us, like all addict writers have written, Charles Baudelaire, the poet, or Malcolm Lowry, the novelist, he gave us a front row seat to the theater of the addict's experience. His 50 published plays, almost all of them, are about addicts, every one of them. His last plays, everybody's drunk, except for Mom. She's sticking a needle in her arm upstairs. But the maid is passed out in the kitchen, even the bartenders are drunk, and everybody's. Even Dr. Wong read his latest plays, and he said, it's amazing, everybody's drunk in these plays. Yeah. But my point is, he's fully aware. There's no mystery here at all. He is absolutely fully aware of what's going on for him. He described family dynamics, this book here. Brilliant. If you want to understand triangulation, differentiation, transgenerational effects. This book was written well before Murray Bowen at Harvard formalized these concepts and developed the field of family therapy. This is Long Day's Journey into Night. So here's an artist who understood all these concepts. And then, did he lack internal motivation? No, he is famous for, as one of his critics put it, no other writer wrote with such desperation. He is desperate to get recovery. There's no question about that. He didn't lack motivation. And is he diseased? Well, that one's up in the air, of course. So the mainstream tends to take a pathological approach. So they're going to, something is wrong with O'Neill. Either he lacks motivation, he has maladaptive coping skills, he's got a disease, but there's some deficiency that needs fixing. And then the other thing is they tend to reduce addiction down to a person. So that if someone comes into my office, I'm like a good medical doctor. I can give them the addiction severity index, very well-known instrument in the field, and I can measure out their life in various areas, their occupation and everything, and how, if the addiction is affecting this, come out with a score, and then I can treat the addiction, not the person, the addiction. That would be a very typical mainstream approach. O'Neill, though, challenges all this. He takes a humanistic and, as I'll explain, an existential approach, but he's going to humanize, he's going to force us to humanize the addiction. And the other thing, he's going to look at the individual complex human being. That's what he's most interested in, the individual person. Not an addiction, not a construct of addiction, but a person, a human being. That is what he is most interested in. Okay. Now, I was just reading I forget, Linda Shreese, I think her name is, Leonard's book. And it's, I keep forgetting the name of it. The Veil of Addiction, Witness to the Fire. That was it. And she talks all about artists who are addicts. And she makes this big point of artists are uniquely suited to overcome addiction because of their creativity. And that's true. And a lot of addict artists did give up the drug. Thomas de Quincey, who wrote the granddaddy of all drug books, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, the famous William S. Burroughs, the writer who overcame addiction, John Cheevers, the American novelist. And that's all true. But a lot of writers didn't pull off the same trick. I mean, think of Jack London, the novelist, Malcolm Lowry, who wrote what is considered one of the top 10 novels of the 20th century. He wrote it just down the road from here, over at Deep Cove. Dylan Thomas, the great British poet, and Margaret Laurence, a Canadian. In fact, I saw her, she was at the university I attended as an undergraduate, as an instructor, and I saw her in her last days as she was in the last days of her addiction, and she finally died from active addiction. And so a lot of people say, well, this is what I ask my counseling colleagues sometimes. I say, what if Eugene O'Neill walked in the front door, how would you treat him? You can't really use family therapy because he probably knows more than we do. He probably knows more psychology than we do. And as I said, there's no lack of motivation here. He's not in denial. He understands exactly, in a nuanced way, the dynamics of addiction. So he's a real challenge. And so a lot of my counselor colleagues say, well, he must be special. You know, he's obviously more competent and more creative than the usual addict. But then again, I point out, what about Jack London or Malcolm Lowry or Dylan Thomas or Margaret Laurence? They're pretty special people too. They tried to pull off the same trick and they died. They committed basically, Margaret Laurence drank herself into death. Actually, all of them did. Malcolm Lowry officially committed suicide from a drug overdose, but it was a very deliberate thing. So I'm not sure he is that special. Here's one guy who died, John O'Brien. And he's most famous, of course, for this book, Leaving Las Vegas, which they made into a movie. And I was very deliberate in choosing this book because, of course, we don't have a lot of time. So he only wrote one book. He's definitely not at the level of Eugene O'Neill, but this is his first book, and it's pretty remarkable as a first book. And he talks all about, the premise of this book is a writer who gets fired for drunkenness, goes to Las Vegas and plans to drink himself to death in 30 days. That's the plan. And along the way, he meets a woman, a prostitute by the name of Sarah. And anyway, it's their interaction until he passes away. But the thing about O'Brien that's obvious, that I really find quite remarkable, is again, there's no ignorance here. In fact, he has his main character, Ben. So Ben is sitting with Sarah, and Sarah is growing attached to this man, and Sarah says to him, "Why are you a drunk? Like, why are you killing yourself?" And Ben makes the comment, or I'll just read the rest of it. "Do you want to kill yourself? Are you saying that you're drinking as a way to kill yourself?" She leans over the table close to him, listening intently, and he replies, "Or killing myself as a way to drink." That's actually very profound. That's a very, very good insight into the nature of addiction. He's not going out to kill himself. He's going out to drink, but in the process of drinking, that's the goal. He is actually, and he recognizes he will have to kill himself. But the goal is actually to drink. And Ben understands his problem. I mean, there's no mystery here. He understands he is alone in the universe. He's lonely. And he actually understands the solution. There's a very famous comment in here where he's looking at Sarah, and he knows the solution. He knows, he says, "I know I could find happiness with this woman." He knows it. But his very next act is to take another drink. So there's no ignorance here. And in fact, his father, John O'Brien, who wrote the novel, his father actually said later, John O'Brien died just as this novel was being turned into a movie. John O'Brien's father said that this novel was his suicide note. Yeah. But not because of lack of awareness. That was the kicker. And if we look at the similarities of these two writers, they're both considered hopeless alcoholics. They both used art to make sense of suffering. They both understood addiction. They both had good self-awareness. They both wrote, this is what they're famous for, emotional intensity. And both of them took characters and what I call stripped them naked against reality. When you and I get into some trouble, or we have some crisis we're facing, we can always pull back and say, well, I'm a good father, or I'm a counselor, I help people, or I'm a good neighbor, or I'm a good member of my community. Not the characters of these two writers. These people are stripped naked. They cannot retreat into any sort of middle-class respectability. They have to face the world naked and deal with their crisis without any crutch. That's why they chose these characters. That's why Eugene O'Neill always writes about prostitutes and people in what would be considered the downtown east side in Vancouver, because they have nothing to fall back on. They can't say I'm a good father. They can't say, I'm a taxpayer, I'm a good member of the community. They can't say that. And so they're forced to face reality every day at an existential level. So that both of these writers did that. So John O'Brien, just to give you, so this is the guy who died. Give you some background. And some of the patterns that inform this work is that even though he's self-aware, he doesn't have any real connection with himself. And he talks about this in the book constantly. It's like whenever I'm getting close to Sarah, it's not me. The real me is just getting drunk. And he talks about this dissociation from himself. He has no authentic connection with the environment. And John O'Brien's very clever. I mean, he chose Las Vegas. Las Vegas is famous for superficiality. Even Britney Spears gets married there as a lark, right? Because there's no guts to the place. It's all flash, no substance. And that was very deliberate. No authentic connection with each other. Even though Ben and Sarah are together, there's no real connection. All they're doing is they're both lonely, and then Ben looks at Sarah and says, I'm so lonely, I need to use you to take away my loneliness. And Sarah the same way. Sarah's very lonely, so she's going to use Ben to take away her loneliness. So not an authentic connection of love here. They're in many ways just using each other. And no connection with a higher purpose. In this novel, Ben's only goal, which he makes very clear, is to live right now, and the purpose of that life is to get drunk. There is no long-term goal anywhere. Or as I'm just thinking Dr. Wong would say, if they were playing a game of soccer, they'd be looking at the ball. But the point is you have to look at the goal. You have to know where you're going with the ball. It's no good playing with the ball because all you do is just wind up going like this. You always need to keep your eye on the goal, on the future, on some higher purpose. But Ben isn't doing that. He's just going to get drunk. So one of the questions I always have is, why? Because you would think any normal, healthy human being would want to do that. Why doesn't he have, and I just borrow this phrase from Viktor Frankl, a fighting human spirit, or the defined human spirit? Why won't he fight for a better life? And again, this is not out of denial or ignorance. And in fact, there's a sentence in here. He and Sarah, they are at once seeing for the first time decisions they have made and unexpected options that they may now have. So they are aware things could be different. So it's not out of denial or ignorance. But what happens is they're just too wrapped up in the misery of their own suffering to be able to see anything beyond that. So their world is this big. And for those of you who are versed in modern art, you know that this is a typical condemnation of modern art. This is T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men. Here's the people trying desperately to make meaning of their lives, but they can't. Their voices are dried. We are the hollow men, we are the dead men. You know. Their heads are filled with straw. And it's filled with straw, and their words are meaningless because they're so trapped in their own suffering. They just cannot break out of that. They're just totally focused on the now. Yeah. But O'Neill lived. So John O'Brien committed suicide. O'Neill lived. And he understood what his actual problem was. And he gave us in one phrase, in Long Day's Journey into Night, this is his entire life. He says, I will always be a stranger who never feels at home, who can never belong. That's his problem. He is disconnected from life. And if we trace the 50 plays and the 30 years that it took to write him, we discover that this sense of belonging, this is his work. From play 1 to play 50, he's desperately trying to figure out how to belong. And he's not a good systematic philosopher that's just like hit and miss. He's just trying stuff out, it works, it doesn't. Yeah. But at least he knows his problem. And if we look at all his plays, this is the pattern of his recovery right here. As a young man in active addiction, 24-year-old, 25, 26 years old, all of his plays, about maybe half dozen of them, were all based on this sense of he is the victim. He's the victim of his family, he's the victim of money, he's the victim of whatever, fate. And that was the conclusion, that's the theme of the first half dozen books. And if he's the victim, why not get drunk? So he did. Yeah. Or then he comes up with the next one, made famous in Anna Christie. Says, look at life is fate. I'm going to be born, and then I'm going to spend the rest of my time basically moving towards death, because that is the fate of all human beings. And so what we have to do then, it's in the struggle that life becomes important. That's the Sisyphine from existential, from Albert Camus. So what I have to do is I have to accept that this is my fate, and by accepting it, the theory being, then I can rise above it. But it didn't work very well, and he still got drunk. Then he got the idea that he was going to, if he could just figure out this fragment, unite this fragment itself, which he called the Apollonian and the Dionysian. This is the wish for good order. That's what this one is. So life, a good life means, I go to get a job, go to work every day, get married, do all the official things, lots of good structure. And this part is the urge towards ecstasy. And if I could just, and this, by the way, this has about a 2,500 year tradition, actually 5,000 year tradition in Western thought, beginning with the ancient Greeks. They said the perfect life is if you could mesh this idea of good order and structure with this yearning just for ecstasy. And if you put those two together, then you could lead the good life. And so he tried that. It didn't work very well either, and he still got drunk. And then he thought this idea of eternal recurrence would work. This is right from Nietzsche. Any of you are versed in philosophy, this is Friedrich Nietzsche's main theme. And eternal recurrence is just the idea that I am part of the cosmos. I will live and I will die as an individual, but from a more magnificent perspective, I am part of life itself. I am one more actor in the drama of the big cosmic way of life. So he tried that and kept getting drunk. So it didn't work out too good. And then he stopped drinking only when he hit this stage, responsibility, where he finally figured out that it's, to Eugene O'Neill, it's up to me. I'm the only one who can live my life. And regardless of the fact that capitalism may not be good for me, or my parents may be bad for me, or any other form of suffering, in the end, it doesn't matter. It's still up to me. I'm the author of my life. I have to make the decisions, regardless of anything. And when he figured that out, he stopped drinking. But he wasn't happy. That would have to wait until he hit this one. This is the theme of his last 3 or 4 plays, caring for the other. And his idea was this. He said, look, in this world, there's no natural inherent goodness or anything. It's not like God is up there. He's a Nietzschean, basically. And he believes there is no God. This world is just this churning, chaotic mass of energy. No beginning, no end, no direction, pays no attention to human wants or desires. So how, and this was the search for the sense of belonging, how do you find a sense of belonging in this world that pays no attention to what you want? And what's the point of it? And he finally concluded that the only important thing was to care for each other. That was the actual conclusion. He said, and that's the only thing that ever made sense to him. So love was actually the answer. And then when he found this, then he got happy. Actually, he fell in love for real. Okay. Now, I'm thinking of, these are more of the details. Basically, the point of him is he always believed in the fundamental importance of the individual human being. As I mentioned before, he was an atheist, and he really, and this is a lot of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, considers organized Christianity as the cause of suffering, the concept being, I will live morally in this life and suffer in the hope that once I die, I'll find redemption. And O'Neill said, what a ridiculous way of living your life. Why don't you live a happy life on this earth? That's the concept. But anyway, these are more deep. I'm just whipping through this because we're running out of time. So in the end, this is how we got happy. So caring for the other within this universe that pays no attention to human values or wants. And he understood that caring for the other was not a perfect solution. And this is a basic tenet of all existential thinking, is that to live is to suffer. It is as natural as a heartbeat. If you live, you will suffer. And acceptance of that is a primary. So in anything, including relationships with people you love dearly, you will suffer. They will do things to you and you will be hurt. And you will do things to others and they will be hurt. So it's an acceptance that this is simply the way the real world works. And the problem with drunkenness, he figured out, was because all it does is it allows for what I call this oceanic blending with the universe, and it gets rid of the individual. So as O'Neill says in probably the most famous passage in this play, he talks about what it's like to be drunk, and he's talking to his father. It's an autobiographical play, by the way. He's talking to his father, and his father's drunk, and he's drunk. And his brother, right after the scene's going to come in drunk and pass out on the floor. Mom's upstairs with a needle in her arm shooting morphine, and the cook and the maid have passed out in the kitchen. They've been drunk for the last 12 hours. And his father asks him, name me one time when you felt good in your life. And Eugene O'Neill mentions this time when he was in the Merchant Marines. And he's on the deck of a ship at midnight, and he's looking out into the ocean alone. And this is what he says. He says, I became drunk with the beauty and singing rhythm of the sea. And for a moment I lost myself, actually lost my life. I was set free. I belonged within peace and unity and a wild joy. I belonged to something greater than my own life or the life of man. I belonged to life itself. To God, if you want to put it that way. All right? And that worked as a drunk. But the problem is, if you belong to life itself, the individual, is lost. And then he makes, right after that little speech, he says to his dad, but in a moment, oh, actually, I'll quote it. So he's just talking about belonging to life itself, to God, if you want to put it that way. Like a saint's vision of beatitude, like the veil of things as they seem drawn back by an unseen hand. And for a second you see, and seeing the secret are the secret. For a second there is meaning. Then the hand lets the veil fall, and you are alone, lost in the fog again, and you stumble on toward nowhere for no good reason. Right? So it's as a solution, drunkenness doesn't work. You can lose yourself by blending with the universe, becoming part of life itself, but as soon as the booze is finished, you're stuck. As soon as sobriety returns, you're right back to where you were. A temporary solution, an artificial solution. And just so in that very brief description, comparing the two people, one of the great things about O'Neill is he never gave up. And this, I personally think, may be the whole key to recovery. Never give up, never say die, never say quit. Regardless of what happens, always keep fighting. The people who don't fight commit suicide. Happens every day in our city, actually. The next pattern is accept suffering, acceptance. In therapy, this is fundamental, to find acceptance. But O'Brien, he didn't really accept it. It was more of a surrender. He was going to give up. It was a surrender to life. But after you accepting life and accepting suffering won't make you happy. That will demand that you affirm life is worth living in spite of suffering. Or what Viktor Frankl actually called the tragic optimism. But O'Brien, he could never affirm life was worth living. He could never affirm that life was worth fighting for because he's too preoccupied with his own misery, his own loneliness, his own pain. And this, by the way, this Rollo May and, in fact, Carl Rogers, too, great psychologists, they actually, this is one of the big knocks they had on the 20th century. And Rollo May was very clear. He said, it's too bad more people don't fight for life. And that Rollo May believed that this was one of the main reasons why so many people were going to counseling and there was so much neuroses around. And the way to pull off this whole trick is, again, this idea of caring for another, to get out of yourself and help another and to care for another. But these people, too wrapped up in their own pain, they can't do that. It's just not possible. They're too narcissistic, too self-centered. They can't break out of their own misery. This is translating that into therapy for the lessons in recovery. This is a model we use at the Maple Ridge Treatment Center. This actually comes from 1992. Chandler, Holden, and somebody with a T. I can't remember. Anyway, And I always make this comment to my clients. They always tell me about like their aftercare plans. Well, what are you going to do? Well, this is also school. Well, I'm going to go back to school and get a job. Oh, I'm going to go to the gym, work out, go to the dentist, go to the doctor. Oh, I'm going to go to counseling once a week and deal with my emotional issues. I'm going to, go make some clean and sober friends and all that, and, I'll change the way I'm thinking. And I asked them, dead serious, I said, how long, statistically speaking, if that's your plan for recovery, how long do you think you're going to last? Statistically speaking, they will last 3 months if they do all those things I just described, statistically speaking. And they'll be really lucky if they last 6 months. And the main reason is, and I tell them, or we actually process this, and they come to the conclusion that if they actually do that for 6 months, they will be so bored out of their minds that they'll relapse. Guaranteed. Guaranteed. Because addicts who are used to living a life at the level of a soap opera cannot handle all this healthy-mindedness. They can't deal with it. So what I tell them is this is what they're going to need, this idea of spiritual. This is Viktor Frankl's meaning and purpose in life. The reason is, if you understand where you're going, if you understand the goal, if you have meaning and purpose in your life, you now know why you're going to get a good job. If you understand the big picture, you now have a reason to go to the doctor and brush your teeth every day and visit the dentist. If you know where you're going, if you have a mission, a purpose in life, you now have a reason to go to counseling and deal with your anger and depression and whatever else you're going to. And the same thing with making new friends and with thinking. But the key is the reason. And this is what this model is all about. This is a model, I think the title is a model for spiritual wellness. That the key here is you must have a reason for doing this. If you don't have a reason, if you just say, well, I'm just going to get a good job and go to the gym every day, you're doomed. And we know this psychologically speaking. As I said, if you just play with the outside stuff, statistically speaking, the typical average will last about 3 months, and then they'll relapse. And that's just reality. I just want to, okay. Oh, we're on the last slide, good, excellent. So, lessons for recovery from O'Neill. We discover, as I mentioned, that O'Neill didn't actually stop drinking while he was progressing through those patterns. He stopped drinking only when he figured out the meaning. That was the key. And I always wonder, too, in our treatment, if we were using the famous Minnesota model, the prerequisite or the first step of recovery is to put a cork in the bottle. And after we put a cork on the bottle, and some counselors say up to 2 years, then we'll start dealing with the real stuff. And O'Neill says, maybe not. Maybe that's not the way the dynamic actually works in practice. Maybe it's once you start getting some meaning and purpose in your life, then the natural consequence is abstinence. And this is what Stanton Peele was talking about this morning, right? Is to get that meaning and purpose in your life. To find something, and then you realize, well, drinking won't lead me there. But in a lot of mainstream therapy, we say abstinence is the first step or the prerequisite to recovery. Or, taking a step down, we have the goal as harm reduction. As a counselor, I work in a harm reduction treatment center. It's a direct service of the Fraser Health Authority, and the policy of the government of British Columbia and the government of Canada is harm reduction. So as a therapist, I may hope my clients go on and live a happy, productive, contented life, but as a therapist, I limit myself to reducing harms in basically statistical significance in various life areas. I hope that they will end up in the hospital fewer times 1 year after treatment than in the previous 12 months before treatment. I hope that they will be arrested fewer times in the 12 months after treatment than in the 12 months preceding treatment. And that's actually how we measure success rates in addiction treatment now, is a statistical significance. Not that they've stopped using or had happy lives or anything, but statistically significant harm, reduced harm in various life areas. But the goal for O'Neill is now, You have to find the sense of belonging. You have to feel, how do I live a happy life in this world in spite of suffering? That's the goal that O'Neill shot for. This approach, generally known, of course, as cognitive behavioral, motivational enhancement therapy. I just use that's William Miller's bit. Or pharmacotherapy. These are all the evidence-based mainstream therapies now. But O'Neill, obviously, he takes an existential approach, as I call it. These tend to be deficit approaches, that there's something lacking in the individual. This is more an approach, a positive approach. In other words, where do you want to get to? And then, not that Eugene O'Neill for 1 second ever thought he was mentally ill or anything, but where did he want to get to? These, I look at them as tend to be dealing only with the immediate presenting problems. This is great for managed care, right, where you only have a limited number of sessions. But this tends to be more depth psychology. Although Dr. Wong swears you can do this fairly quickly. And I've actually seen him with clients that no one else will touch, actually in 6 sessions, pull them out of the morass that they've been in. And again, as I mentioned, this tends to be an eye on the presenting problems, on the immediate problems. This is going to deal with the presenting problems, but also looks at the big picture. Yeah. So I think the lesson that, and not only, and I just borrowed Eugene O'Neill and compared him to John O'Brien. You could take any of the great writers, from Baudelaire to Quincey. One of my favorites is Euripides from 2500 BC. He writes all about the same ideas. And the lessons that I think we can take out of this is that they all say, and this is amazing, it's like they all got around the same table and talked about it, is that they drank or used drugs as a response to feeling that their lives were meaningless, monotonous, and boring. That's why they actually used the drugs. Not because of childhood abuse and all that. Like Malcolm Lowry is very clear. He talks about childhood abuse in his novel, which is like 500 pages, and he talks about it for 50 pages, and he ends up saying, but that's not really the reason that I ever used drugs. Yeah?
Wasn't that what O'Neill was saying when he gave that quote? He wasn't talking necessarily about drunkenness with alcohol,
Right.
but drunkenness with music, with arts, or whatever, that
Right.
sense or trance that
Right.
the addict wants that to be consistent.
Right.
It's an all or nothing.
Yeah, yeah. And that's, yeah, and he borrowed that from Nietzsche, of course. And Nietzsche used Wagner's music, actually, as an example of that, where they tapped into, this is a bit of philosophy, the will to, and then the will was this just churning energy of birth and death and rebirth and all that, and to tap into that. And Nietzsche had always maintained that if you listen to Richard Wagner's music, then you could tap into that, and that was real. That was very, very real. Yeah, yeah. And he borrowed that concept. But he does very specifically talk about drunkenness, and I've only used the works. If you actually look at his life as well, and you see that in the pattern of his life as well. But you're quite right, yes. It could be done with any number of things. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have anything on alcohol as a stimulant for writing that you hear about people with writer's block and people deliberately getting stoned before they sit at the typewriter?
Oh yeah, lots. It seems to be an individual thing. There are people who swear there's a very great Canadian, Timothy Finlay. He tried giving up drinking and lasted 3 months because he said, I can't write. So he went out, so he drinks a bottle a day, and now he's won all the Governor General's Award. And yeah. So for people like Timothy Finlay, other people swear that it's impossible to write when they're drinking. Eugene O'Neill, except for one play, did not drink while he wrote. So he would spend like 12, 16 hours a day writing, and he would do that until the play was finished, and then he'd get drunk. Yeah. So I think it's an individual thing. At least what I have read with the various authors. Yeah. Yeah. But it's it always is in the back of my mind. This is what scares me as a therapist, is I keep thinking, what if someone like Eugene O'Neill walks into the Maple Ridge Treatment Center? What am I going to do with this guy? I mean, this is a for me as a therapist, this is frightening because none of this stuff is going to work. Not a chance. And this guy's a card-carrying genius, incredibly creative. He reads spectacular amounts. He's intense motivation. And I don't know, what do I do? Give him a workshop on communication skills or something? Yeah. But at any rate, yeah, just maybe a little different way of looking at it. Yeah. So we better let you have some coffee here.